Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Markwitt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
Today we're going to do something a little different. One of the things about these podcasts is these often arise from conversations that Antonia and I are having, like in the car driving somewhere, just walking, like in our house, casual conversations. We're like, man, stop talking. Let's we should do this for a podcast. And some recent events, we're going to do a podcast today that's really going to take some of the things we've talked about in previous podcasts, and we're going to use a situation here in the United States that's happening at the time of this recording to illustrate how we tend to think about things using the same frameworks and models that we often teach at Personality Hacker. And it might be a really interesting conversation for you to hear, and you might want to adopt some of the ways that we weave some of the models together because we think it might be beneficial. And let me just give you a little context of what's happening. So we're going to have a conversation today with the backdrop of the Baltimore City riots here in the United States. So Baltimore is a fairly large city. If you're not from the United States, if you're listening, globally, Baltimore is one of the largest cities on the East Coast. There's probably a couple million people in the metro area. It's very close to our nation's capital, Washington, D.C., and it's about 3 hours south of New York City. So if you know where New York City is on a map, it's about 3 hours south of there. And it has been notoriously known for a lot of racial tension and a lot of violence. I think it's number 2 for murders per capita after Detroit here in the United States. So it's a very, it's a big city with a lot of big city problems. And recently, in the last week, there was a young African-American man who was arrested by police. And in the process of his arrest, somehow his spinal cord was injured and he ended up dying. He died, and what ended up happening was the city of Baltimore, a lot of the residents in the city of Baltimore felt like this was an injustice, and there were some riots that erupted in the last few days. And so the city of Baltimore has been in somewhat chaos. They've had to call the National Guard, I think 2,000 soldiers in to come keep peace. The police are on the streets in riot gear, and there's videos online. If you Google this, Baltimore City riots 2015, you would see videos of people throwing trash cans through police cars, lighting cars on fire, breaking windows, looting shops, all of these kind of things. And this is what's been happening. The reason why we chose this, there's a lot of stuff going on in the world.
Well, it didn't start with riots. It actually started with protests.
Well, that's true,
and
yes.
The reason why that's relevant is because there's a general sense in the United States. I mean, this is not the first place that protesting has happened over, basically a black life being lost in the hands of, in the hands of police. This has been a national issue for a while. I think it's a stack, really. I think the reason why, we're going to talk about some of the reasons why maybe riots broke out. However, initially it started out as a peaceful protest. And while the protesters were protesting and then the rioters were rioting, the protesters were actually very upset about the rioting, because it was interrupting what they were trying to get accomplished, which is, justice for this, this person that died, the justice for this family. So I just wanted to add the piece that it wasn't just riots. It was actually peaceful protesting. Far more people were peaceful protesting than rioting. But then these riots broke out. So then the question is, why did the riots break out if there was peaceful protesting going on?
Yeah, and thank you for mentioning that, because that is absolutely true. That's a very big piece of what was happening there. I think the reason why I had skipped that part inadvertently is because most people are hearing, the news narrative. If you followed the news, and this is the time of this recording, obviously, or you do a search, you're going to see the word riot come up everywhere, because it's so visceral. You see it so viscerally. But you're absolutely right. It was peaceful protests. And these have happened around the country in the last few months and years based on the disparity between people feeling like, or it's happened because people feel marginalized or mistreated often by police force or police officers in various communities around the United States. And this is just the most recent one of those instances. And so why are we talking about Baltimore? Why did we choose this to talk about? I mean, there's stuff happening all over the United States. There's stuff happening all over the world. I mean, we just had an earthquake in Nepal. We have other violent things happening, obviously, on the continent of Africa. There's various things happening around the world that are not good things. The reason why we chose this is obviously it's timely. At the time of this recording, it's happening right now. But second, it's very personal to both you and I, because I lived in Baltimore City for 5 years, in inner city Baltimore City, like in the city, not in a suburb, but in downtown Baltimore, like part of the city for 5 years. And I worked there. And both of my sons live with their mom in inner city Baltimore. So we're recording this right now, and my dad is actually driving to pick up my two sons in Baltimore City as we speak.
Yeah.
He's right there right now picking them up to bring them up here for the weekend to spend time with us.
Right.
And, he's in the middle of the city right now while this is happening. So we go down there about twice a month to engage with my boys, and we're down there a lot. I've been inside, all over Baltimore. It's a very personal story for us. And it's great because it gives me the ability to look through some of the frameworks, some of the models that we teach here at Personality Hacker to look at this sober-mindedly, to not make, cause and effect statements about, well, this is happening because X. Well, it's a bigger issue than just X or Y causing Z to happen, right? And so we want to unpack a little bit of this today and just give you a little bit of how we think about things now that we've learned some of these models and frameworks.
Yeah, to clarify, this is actually not going to be a full diagnostic on or even a prescription on what to do about the challenges that Baltimore City faces, or even the United States faces with this particular issue. As Joel mentioned before, this is a backdrop. What we really want to focus on is these models and maps that we've talked about in previous podcasts. They can get real abstract real fast. The concepts are very intriguing and interesting. However, being able to see things through the lens of these maps and models are really where the power is. So this is more of like an application podcast. This is more about, so now that I've learned about systems thinking or general semantics or the Graves model, like what does that mean in reality? Like what does that mean in the real world?
Yeah, and so if you haven't listened to the podcast on those three topics, we have a podcast on general semantics, a podcast on the Graves model, and a podcast on systems thinking. Those are going to be some of the biggest frameworks we're going to use today to to start talking about this. So it might be good to pause this, go and listen to those three, and then come back, or listen to this and then go back and get some reference material after the fact. But those are great to interface with today's podcast.
Right. I had heard a quote attributed to Einstein that I actually don't know if it's Einstein or not. I mean, there's so many quotes that get attributed to so many great thinkers that it's hard to really know who said what. However, regardless of whether or not Einstein said this, whoever did say it was a genius. And that is when they were asked if they had an hour to save the world, what would they do? And presumably Einstein said, well, I'd spend 55 minutes defining the problem. That always really struck me as being something that our modern world has not entered a space where they value sophisticated questions. They value sophisticated ways of defining problems. We live in a time period of sound bites, of cause and effect thinking, of correlation equaling causation, because it's easy. Our lives go so quickly, our lives go so fast, and we want quick solutions to problems. If I'm overweight, I want a pill. Give me a pill, and this diet drug is the way that I'm going to lose weight. I don't actually want to alter my eating habits. I don't actually want to take up an exercise regime. I just want a pill, makes me skinny. Okay, now I'm good to go. And so because we have this, life is moving too fast, I can't really think about it, I can't really make life changes, I can't really make mimetic changes, then we run into the same challenges over and over again, and we're baffled. We're like, what? Why is this happening again? Like, I took the pill and I lost 15 pounds. Why, when I got off the pill, did I gain it back and then 5 pounds more? Like, there's just really legitimate confusion around why we can't seem to actually solve these challenges. And our suspicion is that we aren't defining the problems well enough. We're not pulling in enough truly sophisticated thinking, thoughtful ways of breaking down what's actually going on. And so when we make a change, it's really surface. It's a soundbite change. It's just like a quick little if you want to make the street safer, you arrest more people, right? Not really asking, are there implications to arresting more people? What happens if we arrest a bunch of people and we can't charge them with anything? Or what happens if we just arrest a bunch of people and throw them in prison? Is that actually going to solve a problem? Or is that going to generate a whole new batch of problems? How do we create sustainable solutions to some of the major challenges that we face? So Baltimore City's situation, and probably other situations that are ancillary to it, are going to, as Joel mentioned, make a backdrop to utilizing what we believe are some of the best ways of defining problems, really defining challenges, and not just going, oh, well, it's this thing. Oh, well, it's this thing, right? Like going, maybe it's a whole system. Maybe there's a bunch of nodes in the system. And if there's a bunch of nodes in the system, then how do we break that down and go, it could be this and this and this, and then how all three of those things are actually interacting with each other. Now we really have some true content to work with. Now we have some real, solid basis for making sustainable changes and making the emergence we want from systems actually the authentic emergence.
So how do we dig into this? Again, we're not going to attempt to solve the problems of Baltimore City. Obviously, there are politicians and other people and community leaders that are involved in this. We are just using this again as a conversation piece.
It's a thought exercise.
Exactly.
We actually could be completely, totally wrong with all of our assertions, but that's not the point. The point is that it's a thought exercise.
Yeah, and I think it's valuable to go through these kind of things. So to start us off, let me just briefly, especially for you listening if you're not from the United States, because I think getting a little bit of historical context from where we're starting from, and then we can go into more modern here. But if you remember, the United States is a country that was split off from England in the 1700s. We developed our own country here. And at the time of the founding of the United States, slavery, the ability to own people, was a legal right of people in the southern part of the United States. And it ended up that we, in the 1800s, the 1860s, entered into a civil war between the northern factions of the United States and the southern factions. It was a lot about how we would make laws and things, but the issue that brought all that to light was this issue of slavery. And obviously slavery was outlawed in the 1860s through Abraham Lincoln. There was a war fought over it, and it was abolished. But there were a lot of social problems because the South didn't recognize this people group that now had been freed in the United States. They didn't recognize this people group as valid. And so you had a lot of separation of people groups. You had in the South, at one point, you had African American people, black people having to go to different bathrooms than white people or use different drinking fountains. And then in the 1960s, we had another a head to a pimple that needed to be popped, and we had the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King and some other leaders in the black community that said, hey, we want to make changes here. And so the United States went through another evolutionary change of increasing the rights for people that had been marginalized and had their rights not given fully to them, even though they were quote unquote free people. The state of Maryland, where Baltimore lives, is an interesting state because during all of this, it straddles basically two ideologies in the United States. Now, I'm grossly oversimplifying all of this just to give you a basic historical context if you're from overseas, if you're not part of the United States and you don't really understand our history or culture. Baltimore City and the state of Maryland was caught between two different factions. And so it was basically a melting pot of a lot of turmoil because you had the North, Pennsylvania and North was considered officially the North during the Civil War. And then Virginia and South was considered officially the South during the Civil War. And Maryland was the state, the area in between both of those places. So they declared themselves neutral, but you had sympathizers for both sides during this time period.
Yeah, they were kind of geographically, technically the North, but then at the same time, one of the biggest slave auctions in the country was in Annapolis, Maryland, correct?
I don't know how they technically defined themselves. I believe because they were south of the Mason-Dixon line, they were actually technically part of the South.
Okay.
They see themselves Southern, but again, it was up for debate during that time period because there was, you had sympathizers for both sides, and so this was, and everybody in the area is very close together. The capital of Richmond for the Confederacy during this time period was just a few, miles south of Washington, D.C., which was the capital for the North. So you have these two capitals really close to each other, right in Virginia, and then Maryland's just to the north of that. And then Baltimore City is this industrial hub. And then there was a major slave auction in Annapolis, just 30 miles or so south of Baltimore, where people were being sold like cattle. So this is in the state of Maryland happening as well. So you can trace back the roots of racial tension, horrible things happening to people way back to the founding of our country in this area. Like this area has been a hotbed for this since our country founded. It's just been difficult for people on all sides, particularly African-American people, because they were under slavery at this time. So this is just a little bit of historical context. I hate to take all that time to explain all that, but that's where we're starting from. That's our starting place. Mm-hmm. And then the city of Baltimore itself, is right in, it's right smack in the middle of Maryland.
So fast forward to 2015.
Yeah.
And Baltimore City had massive riots that happened after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr.
In 1968.
They had major riots, horrible riots. Like there are parts of the city that have never recovered from those riots. And then fast forward to 2015, and Baltimore has a lot of economic issues. There's huge disparity between the haves and have-nots. There's a major poverty, like below the poverty line issue. You were looking up the statistics. Do you remember what
I
it
don't
was?
remember them off the top of my head, but
Okay.
it's high. It's not a good situation for a lot of people.
And apparently, like just 10 years ago, around 2005, the mayor at the time, was it the mayor that called for...
Yeah, I think Mayor O'Malley in 2005, I was reading this statistic, I do remember, I believe they made like 100,000 arrests in 2005.
In Baltimore City?
Out of a population of 600,000 people.
In the
actual city itself. Like
Right.
the metro area's got several million, but the inner city part, like city dwellers, there's about 600,000 people that live there or so. And a sixth of those people were arrested at one point or another during the year of 2005.
Right. So, and not all of them, I mean, they didn't have charges that stuck necessarily. And so not everybody was actually incarcerated, imprisoned. However, I mean, you can see sort of the culture of, there's just a lot of tension in general. There's a lot of concepts of like impoverishment and haves and have-nots and racial tension that stems back to riots that people are still alive were in those riots, right? Like baby boomers were in the riots themselves on one side or the other. And so there's just a lot of, this is like a hotbed of a situation. And like Joel mentioned, we drive there every other weekend. And as we enter Baltimore, there's a lot of conversations that we've had, even pre-protests, pre-riots. And admittedly, this situation of, a black person's life being lost in the custody of police is not a Baltimore City issue. It's a national issue. Ferguson was in Missouri, and Ferguson was the other, city that had massive riots and protests going on at the loss of life, of a black life in police custody. So this is not just a Baltimore City issue, but it's very intriguing and not surprising at all to me that this would be a place where massive rioting would happen, with this particular issue. So it's a national stack, but it's also a local stack, I believe, for Baltimore. And one of the big, news bite justifications for what was going on with the rioters, because there were tons of peaceful protesters. I think I read someplace there was like 10,000 peaceful protesters right after, that it was known to have happened. And then there was rioting that just came on the scene, like almost like as a surprise. And then the spin was, well, it's just a bunch of opportunistic teenagers, right? Like it's just a bunch of teenagers who have decided that, they're going to use this backdrop as a reason to go riot. And that's a very interesting spin for what's going on there. Because, you can watch video clips of like 40-year-old men, right? Like being part of the riots. And you can see that the people who are rioting in, the small stores, like the pharmacy stores and the convenience stores, drug stores and convenience stores, are not teenagers, right? They're people who are in their 20s, 30s, 40s. So it's very interesting to see the spin that it's a bunch of opportunistic teenagers. So the question is, like, what is going on here? A really interesting quote I recently read from Martin Luther King Jr. is that riots are the language of the unheard, right? Or something to that effect. I might be paraphrasing it incorrectly, but it's riots are the language of the unheard. So let's pretend that the rioting isn't simply opportunistic. Let's pretend that the rioting is as we observe it, and that is that it's the language of the unheard. So why do people feel disenfranchised? Why are so many people feeling unheard in Baltimore City? Why did peaceful protesting on one side of the city turn into rioting on another part of the city? And we feel like if we can see some of these issues through the lens of some of these systems, there may be some actual diagnostics there. There may be actual defining the problem so that a person who's maybe much smarter than me can figure out a solution to it.
Yeah.
So the first system that we automatically came up for us was the concept of general semantics, like we talked about in a previous podcast. we talked about how there was a difference between protesters and rioters, right? Like
the news media doesn't seem to get this, though.
Yeah, I mean, because the rioters are so much more interesting for news. But there's a difference between the protesters and the rioters. But there's also a difference between the styles of protesters and the styles of rioters. Just classifying them as just protesters or rioters already is a gross oversimplification. There's going to be different protesters and different styles of protesters, as well as different rioters and different styles of rioters. Like some rioters may actually be opportunistic teenagers. That might actually be accurate. And then there's going to be rioters who are taking advantage of a time period to be, to engage in the language of the unheard. So right there, if you start breaking down what's actually happening in the moment, you've got Rioter 1, Rioter 2, Rioter Classification 3, Rioter Classification 4, right? Like you've got all these different styles of rioters, and then that helps you understand maybe people are trying to communicate something a little different. What is the overarching theme of all of this? Not just that one kid who's an opportunist, but what is actually attempting to be communicated by people who don't feel heard. And the same with the protesters. Why are there different styles of protesters? What are they protesting? What is the overarching theme? Can we figure out what is actually attempting to be communicated here that isn't just, we can just dismiss it because it's not something we really want to talk about or see?
Absolutely. And I think this gives us much more nuance. I don't understand, like, if I was put in a position of power, which I don't know if I'll ever be in politics or something, but I can imagine how this would be very helpful to see classifications of the people in whatever area you're governing or whatever area you're trying to help as more nuanced than just giant groups of people that have an interest. Like these interest groups, I think even those can be broken down. And so if you're governing, you're looking at things like this, and even the police on the ground, if they had a more idea of general semantics of how they thought about the person they're interacting with, what category they fit into, rather than just, this is just a person on the streets here, like in general terms, a violent person on the street. Maybe there's different classifications. I think we applied this toward homeless before, different types of homeless, but maybe different types of criminals, different types of rioters, different types of protesters. It gives you much more nuance, much more information to work with to make better decisions. It just seems obvious and logical to me to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. And it
takes work, though.
It does take work. And I think one of the reasons why we don't automatically see the power of the words that we have and don't automatically, create subgroups to our classifications for more greater nuance is that we can't be as dismissive. There's a bit of hot debate around this word thug that was recently used to describe, another word for the opportunistic teenagers was thugs. These thugs are just going in and rioting. And there has been some debate about whether or not the word thug is appropriate, right? Some people are saying, well, they are thugs, right? That's what they're doing. They're behaving like thugs, so they're thugs. And the other side is like, don't call them thugs. Like, they're already feeling unheard. If you call them thugs, you're just dismissing them even more. And so they're going to do more thuggish things because you're calling them a dismissive word. We don't understand how much our definitions and labels and our words have power over people. If we call somebody a thug, we're actually encouraging them to be thugs. We have already labeled them, and we have a tendency as humans to rise to our labels. That's how we work. So the words we use and the classifications that we have in our minds are actually very powerful for how we engage and interact with other people. And they hear us, right? If they feel unheard, it's because they believe that the conversation is one way. They're hearing us.
I believe that words create our reality to one degree or another. I mean, literally doesn't manifest things out of thin air. You might believe that, and there are arguments for that, but they will project in a view of the world what the thinker thinks the prover proves. What we believe about something, how we classify it, oftentimes becomes a reality, and the words we use are so powerful to destroy or to build up.
Yeah.
The other model and framework that we have been thinking about looking through this is this idea of systems thinking. The idea that there is no such thing as a direct cause and a direct effect. Like A does not cause B, but in fact, B is an emergent of an entire system of things happening. That one tweak in that system of things happening could alter how B looks. So it's not A causes B. It's like 5 billion things in the system cause B, and we don't know all those pieces of that system sometimes. And it's easy to break systems because they're so sophisticated. I mean, just think of your body as a system biologically. You might have an illness, and that a lot of things could have caused the emergence of that illness. You might have a headache. That could be anywhere from brain cancer to
ice cream.
Just ice cream. You ate ice cream really
Yeah.
fast. And so what system is causing that headache to be emergent, right? What is the system underlying that headache as the emergent? And that's just an easy biological system you can think of.
So we started out by talking about that. I mean, we couched all this as being racial. And one of the reasons why we couched it as being a lot of racial tension is because that's how it's painted to most people. And there is definitely a distinctive racial component. However, it's not A, racial tension equals B, riots. There's still different nodes in the system. So what are the other things that are influencing the emergence of riots? Or, I mean, and honestly, riots is a really easy way of saying something in the system is pretty effed up, because otherwise people wouldn't be rioting.
Yeah.
So riots are actually an emergence of a system, but the riots, the emergence or the parts of the system that generate riots, those are actually the real challenges, right? Like the riot is like it's the white head on the pimple, but the actual toxins are underneath the skin. So we're using the word riots almost symbolically, right?
Yeah.
Riots are the symbol that something is not right. And so we talk a lot about the racial tension, and also there are other components, right? There are other things that are generating whatever is causing the riots.
Absolutely. And so we don't pretend to know all of these things, but we have a lot of ideas around what a lot of them might be. So I illustrated the historical context of where Baltimore City and Maryland fit into a historical timeline. So that's obviously a major node, and there's multiple minor nodes in that system that I'm talking about, or that part of the system, right? That's a major node. You know, another major node too, so that's the historical context. Another major node is something we've talked about before, the Graves model. Where do all the people groups, the people that are involved in this challenge in Baltimore City, where do they fall in the Graves model? Where are they on that scale? And how does that impact all the stuff that's happening? Because that has a major impact on how people are going to show up to the world and what they value in their lives right now.
Well, and how they're going to behave to struggle.
Correct.
How they're going to, what their language is going to be for trying to solve problems. How big their worldview is, and how they're going to clash with each other. If you can understand that there are completely different worldviews involved, and that they're running up against each other, it almost stopped, like when you and I talked about this, we're talking years ago, the first time we were like, okay, so let's see if we can figure out the Graves level of Baltimore City. And then we realized how incredibly stratified it was, and how it's almost impossible to say which specific Graves level Baltimore is at, because it's really straddling lots of different levels. And the first time we really talked about that years ago, I stopped seeing the problems in Baltimore as being racial. I saw them almost distinctly as Graves levels, like they're really cultural. And within the different races, right, that are represented, and I would say it's predominantly, the two major predominant races in Baltimore are black and white, basically. You've got other minorities represented, but those are definitely the two biggest races that are represented.
I think 65% of Baltimore City is African American. And I think there's like a smaller percentage of, other minorities besides that, but 65% of the city is African American. And then I think it's like, 20 something percent is white.
Right. Yeah. So the being able to break down exactly where people fall in the Graves levels helps it no longer be exclusively racial, though there are racial components to it as well. And if we can break that down a little bit, I think it might at least be an intriguing thought exercise for why sometimes people just can't seem to figure each other out. So the first thing that really was super obvious to me in Baltimore is that in both the white and the black communities, you've got a strong Graves 2, 3, and 4 culture represented. And that's unusual. It's unusual to have a significant portion of Graves 2s in any city, because most people have graduated to 3 or 4. There's something about the city itself that encourages people to stay at Graves 2. And you can see that by their neighborhoods. They define themselves, their identities by their neighborhoods. There's a neighborhood called Hamden in Baltimore City. And that actually happens to be the neighborhood that your boys live in. And when you go to Hamden, Graves Fives, opportunistic Graves Fives, people who are at a more business level who want to bring in like more culture, more cool, fun, funky stores, maybe even a little bit of Graves Six, like they're getting to a point of being like postmodern. They're taking over what's called the Avenue in the Hamden district. And the local Hamdenites are very upset by this because they're robbing them of their neighborhood, as opposed to seeing it like, cool, fun, funky shops are coming in and there's culture and there's like more places to go have coffee and ice cream and, there's like more cool stuff, hip stuff happening. They're very upset because it's interrupting what is fundamentally a Graves 2 society. Everybody's lived there forever. Everybody knows each other. They all support each other in the small town, or not town, but this small neighborhood. And there was a very strong, if you're Hamden, you're okay mentality, like unconditional love based entirely on the geographic location of where you live, which is a distinctly Graves 2 feel. Unconditional love based on the simple fact that you were born in their same neighborhood.
Yeah, absolutely. And in Hamden, you mentioned this as a tension between, some of the Graves 5 shop owners and entrepreneurs that have come in. And the reason why there's a tension, this is a classically blue-collar, working-class neighborhood. And, Baltimore's a very working-class city, and this is part of their culture, their heritage. This, working in the city, they were the working class of the city, and there's a lot of, and understandably so, pride and identity around that, and that's great. And all of a sudden, they have people moving in, and maybe they had a restaurant that had prices set at a price point that made sense for working class people, and now all of a sudden this new owner comes in, buys this restaurant, and jacks up prices for more of a upwardly mobile, culturally hip, or hipster type culture, and the people in the community feel like, well, now what's for us? We can't afford to go to that restaurant or that shop because we're working class, and now they're coming in and making it quote unquote yuppified. Where does that put us in this space? This is our neighborhood. We almost feel like imposters have come in and hijacked it from us, and we're left holding the back. We're left marginalized here.
Yeah.
And so this is that's not racial in sense. But there's tension there.
I
was living there during this tension and time period and seeing this happen between the people that have lived there for years, like generate 5 generations, and all of a sudden new people that have never lived there moving into that community.
So there's culture classes of Graves levels no matter what race you're talking about. And the reason why it's important to understand that there's a significant population of Graves 2s is that anywhere you have a lot of Graves 2s, you're going to have a lot of Graves 3s. Now, as we mentioned on the Graves level podcast or the Graves model podcast, Graves 3s are the warlord level. This is the level that a lot of people in Western culture went through when they were teenagers, right? So this concept of like the writers were opportunistic teenagers it's not accurate in the sense that there were many people who were not of teenage age, involved in the riots. And then at the same time, it's kind of true too, because they're stuck in a level that is traditionally attributed to teenagers, which is I'm going to get mine, right? Like I'm going out for what I want. I'm going to be in a rebellious time period in my life. Graves 3s don't have a very long timeline, and they have as small a world as Graves 2 do. For the most part, they have a very neighborhood mentality, but it's not unconditional love. It's I'm going to dominate this neighborhood. I'm going to be the big man on campus. I'm going to be the person who goes for what I want. Now, back in tribal cultures, you really saw this with like warlords coming after each other. But in the modern world, we no longer have a tribal feel. So what do warlords end up doing?
Joining gangs.
Yeah, they end up joining gangs. That's exactly it. And so there's an epidemic, I would say, in Baltimore City, way more than other cities. Or at least cities that I'm familiar with, because I'm from the West Coast, and West Coast cities don't tend to have as high a population of Graves 3s.
Have you ever heard of Oakland, California?
Yeah, except for Oakland. we forget about that.
Compton.
If you are from Oakland,
East LA.
If you're from Oakland or Compton or East LA, you know that.
Anyway, long story short, yeah.
That said, there seems to be a higher percentage of Graves 3s in Baltimore than other cities that I've encountered.
Yeah, I can understand what you're saying.
So when there is a riot, it almost always is a riot of Graves 3s. Now, why do Graves 3s feel so marginalized? There's a couple different reasons, most likely. The first thing I can think of is that the world has gone beyond them, right? Graves 3s want to be big man on campus, and the world no longer sees 3 as big man on campus, right? It is no longer a big fish in a little pond. 3s cannot get what they actually want, which is a feeling of empowerment, because the world has moved beyond their level so much that they don't get recognized. So then you have angry, aggressive, rebellious, teenage-style Graves 3 with nothing to do, right? Like, how do they go to the next level?
Well, and by definition, they will not plug themselves into a system. They're pre-plugging themselves into a system of sorts. So they, and we are in a system place. You know, we are a 4-5 culture here in our country, and there's a resistance to go there. And so they're left in this space of, well, I'm certainly not going to buy into your system, but I also want a big man on campus. And there's this tension between those two places they want to be. And I think that also causes some of this dynamic happening.
Yeah, and like you said, we're a predominantly 4-5, country, peaking into 6 in a lot of different places, interestingly enough. But we're not at 6 yet. We're predominantly 4-5. We straddle 4-5 all over the country, and so you've got these Graves 3s that are actively resisting the status quo, which is the next level of their development. But what happened, thousands upon thousands of years ago is that the 3s were the big man on campus. They'd run into each other. They'd realize that they couldn't fight their way out of it because they're evenly matched with this other tribe led by Graves 3, and so they'd start creating territory lines. But that is ancient. That is like that happened a long time ago. There's not really a lot of opportunities for 3s that get stuck in 3 to progress unless they're willing to go to the next level of development, which is right in front of them. Now, interestingly enough, and there's plenty of Graves 3 white people in the whites.
I was going to make sure I clarified that. This is not racial at all. Mm-mm. Like, there are 3s in every culture around the world, no matter the color of your skin, the creed you come from, any of your family background. 3 is a level of development, not a racial or class thing.
One of the most obvious examples of Graves 4 institution is the judicial system. So regardless of whether or not the person is white or black, if they're Graves 3, because they have so many run-ins with police or law enforcement or, the court system or jail or prison or whatever it is, especially if a Graves 3 is like in a gang and feels taken care of in some way, there's going to be a resistance to going to 4, because 4 to them is not shaving your beard and putting on a tie and going and getting a bank job, right? 4 is this institution of the judicial system, which they may have felt has treated them unfairly or poorly. So the resistance to go to 4, regardless of their race, is understandable, because that's what's been set in front of them. And, when you get to higher levels of development, you can kind of see how our Graves 4 judicial system is in some ways, in some ways it's really not sufficient for the level of challenges that they have to face. It's the same thing with government. It's like, why are all the politicians incompetent? It's like, well, because we're facing problems that are much bigger than they've ever been at any time period in history, and we may not have the psychological technology as people to be able to handle these problems. So the Graves 4 institution of the judicial system may not actually be able to handle all of the challenges set in front of them, so they can do it poorly. And if that's the number one institution that a Graves 3 keeps running up against, you could see why they would have a natural resistance to it.
Yeah, and then so now you just said that, so we're going to start weaving some of these things together now. Mm-hmm. In a systems thinking theory, thinking of systems, you want to reward the behavior you desire. So anytime, like the basic rule of economics is you reward what you want to have happen, right? The judicial system is rewarded for, in a sense, arrests, filling prisons, because we have privatized prisons in this country, things of this nature. That's another whole other piece of the system running. And it depends on which jurisdiction you're in, that's the case. But oftentimes we're rewarding the wrong things. And so when a politician comes down to solve these problems, instead of looking at general semantics, instead of looking at systems thinking, instead of looking at the Graves model and trying to classify people and help solve these problems and move people through levels of growth, what is a politician rewarded for? They're rewarded for the election cycle to get into power. And it's usually a 4 to 6 year term in this country. And that's about the timeline they have to be reelected or to get their next person in their party elected. So that's what they're rewarded for. They're not rewarded for solving the problems necessarily. They're rewarded for the election cycle. And so you can see how again, taking this, I'm kind of all over the place, I know with this, but you can see how you almost have to be all over the place because you're starting to pull in pieces of a system. It's not just cause and effect. Well, if politicians would just do the right thing, that's a little oversimplification. I mean, why wouldn't they do what they're rewarded for? That makes sense in any system. That's the emergent. And in all of these things, I think that's what people are doing. And so if we can start to expand how we look at these things as people, and it might not be the politicians or the leaders that do this for us. It might be you listening to this podcast in your community, your country. You might run for mayor in your 300-person little town, and you might introduce some of these concepts in a 300-person little town for systems thinking, general semantics, Graves model, and start to solve problems, and we start changing the hearts and minds of people. Now we start to see a movement of things happening. Because who knows? We all are in this together, and our country borders and all this are becoming more relevant every day, and someday nation states will become completely irrelevant.
Yeah.
Based on modern technology and our global economy.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm so glad you kind of zoomed out again, because it's really easy to get zoomed in on the particulars. It's so interesting to see how when we're at a certain level of development, we forget what it's like to be at a previous level. And when we're at a previous level of development, we haven't actually gotten to the higher level yet. So we don't know what that even looks like. So when we are at varying levels of development, we end up generating and creating clashes because we forget the other person's worldview is fundamentally different than ours. There was a rioter that got caught on video who, I can't remember if he was lighting something on fire or if he was actually cutting like a fire hose that was attempting to put the fire out. And he had this cavalier attitude of like, well, it's not my neighborhood, right? This isn't my problem. This is not my neighborhood. That right there is him articulating his Graves level. He is telling you how big his world is. He's telling you how much territory he is able to take in and understand as impacting him and the people he loves.
How many systems he realizes are impacting his life. He may not realize the neighborhood he's burning down is where the water supply for his neighborhood is, because he doesn't think in those terms yet.
Right. And so when somebody says that, instead of going, that guy's just totally self-centered, right? Like, that guy's a dick. The first thing that I think that we should be seeing, right, if we have some of these models under our belt, is going, oh, I see, that guy's probably at 3. He's probably at Graves 3. He has no idea what's going on. So why is that guy Graves 3? Like, what are we doing to help people in that situation go to Graves 4? So instead of like, let's prosecute them, let's put them in prison, let's surround them by a bunch of other Graves 3s, right? Or 2s or whatever. Or maybe 1 or 2 4s, and then the guy who got for the white collar crime, the 5, right? Like the odd 5 in there. Or the protester 6, right? Like you get like 1 or 2 5s and 6s, and everybody else is a 3er.
You're talking about in prison.
In prisons, yeah. So instead of going, well, let's punish these people, right? Let's be punitive. Instead of thinking that, go, what can we do to encourage, like you said, encourage the behavior we want? What can we do to encourage them to go to Graves 4? That should be the question. These people who are at 2, 3, what can we do to encourage them to go to the next level without feeling like they're selling out, without feeling like they're entering an institution that has been harsh and horrible to them? That requires compassion. It requires us to understand them so well that we stop judging them. Now, that doesn't mean we don't judge their actions, and that doesn't mean that we let people do whatever they want to. That whole concept of thug, right? Like the concept of whether or not to call somebody a thug, it's both appropriate and inappropriate. If somebody is behaving poorly, then they're going to get slapped with a label of inappropriate behavior, and also to slap them with that label encourages them to keep going that direction. So it's not like you just go, oh, well, it'll all work itself out, and let's just see if we can get these all, everybody a job. It's obviously far more complex than that. But I feel like when we use sound bites to oversimplify, the situation, opportunistic teenagers, we're not even attempting to go into the depths of what's happening. We're not even attempting to use models and frameworks to try to determine what could really be going on here.
Yeah, and then you have news media where they're not reporting the news in this country anymore. They're showing a video clip and then spending an hour commenting and discussing it. And I don't think it's typically, it's for good television to sell advertising. It's not a discussion like we're having where we're trying to classify things and understand the problem. They're giving prescriptions for a problem I don't believe they fully understand, these pundits, and it ends up into these debates and arguments for an hour over a video clip of some guy throwing a trash can through a cop car. How helpful is this for the national discord? And all it seems to do is rile people up and get them whipped up into a frenzy of emotion. And obviously, I can totally see why news media does this.
Oh, yeah.
It sells advertising. It's a great television.
Yeah.
You want to tune in and see all this, visceral video images. We can't help it as humans to be fascinated by these kind of things. And so I see why they do it. I mean, I'm sure the riots got way more coverage than the peaceful protests. Mm-hmm. They weren't on the streets like trying to understand people's point of views as much as they're Baltimore's in chaos and burning down. You hear this. I even texted my ex-wife to make sure they're okay down there because the way the news portrayed it is the city is burning to the ground as we speak. And that's actually not what's going on the ground. The news media has hyped some of this up.
Yeah.
And that's another node in the system we have to think about. I mean, that there is also another node as we start to talk about these issues, and we can see how complicated they get as we start to unpack this stuff.
Yeah, in fact, as you're talking about whether or not media, news media is helping or being helpful or actually being a part of the problem, I was thinking the challenge of news in this country is also an emergent of a system, right? Like, why is news coverage so sensationalized? Well, that's a whole emergent of a system on its own. So if we want to do anything about that, that's actually been, I think that was Jon Stewart on The Daily Show. I think that was his passion project, was trying to point out what he thought were the nodes in the system of why news media is so...
He was making it satirical in order to point out how absurd it is.
Yeah, and he was trying, but he was trying to point out that it's actually doing more damage than good. And so all of these, like all of the nodes in the system, are actually emergence of their own system, which is why it gets real complex real fast. So being able to have some of these maps and models, again, it generates an ability to figure out what's actually going on here, or actually doing a little bit of diagnostic. One thing, I mean, this is a crazy idea I had one time when we were driving into Baltimore. And I have no idea if it's a node in the system or not. But this is kind of the level that we're trying to talk about. Maybe these are relevant ideas, and really like being willing to hold space for them is part of the 55 minutes of defining the problem. The Baltimore City is famous. In fact, a lot of these cities in the mid-Atlantic area are famous for what's called row houses. And row houses they were originally designed for coal workers or
factory workers.
Factory workers, right?
Yeah, companies would set these up in giant swaths in neighborhoods and then lease them to their own factory workers. And the company basically owned the house, and you would rent it off them. And I think at one point you could eventually buy it from the company, but they own these for all the workers. All the immigrant workers were coming in during the Industrial Revolution.
So they're like these really long slivered apartments. Townhouses really is what we'd call them on the West Coast. And they're like these slivers of houses that are really long and narrow and are flanked by two more houses or row houses or townhouses or whatever, apartments, whatever you want to call them, that are identical. They're usually like 2 or 3 stories tall. So they're really tall, really long and narrow. And, like basically your whole family lives in this like sliver of a house that's flanked by 2 houses on the side. So your windows are only on basically the front and the back, unless you're lucky enough to have an end house, right? And then you have a third wall that has windows. And so Baltimore is actually very proud of these. Townhouses are row houses are a big deal, and it's part of their charm, right? Like that's something that they see as part of their charm. I've been in a couple different row houses, and I find them to be very difficult to navigate through with sort of people energy. Like it's hard to find a place to congregate because the rooms are so narrow and long.
And they're all walk-through rooms because the nature of the row house makes it so you have to walk through each room to get to the next. So There's no like closed off rooms in a sense. And it opens it up in a weird, not a congregatable way, but like a weird pass-through way.
Right. And I mean, if you believe in something like feng shui, there's like, they all have terrible feng shui. Like there's no real energy, motion, movement that feels good in most of these row houses. And then to top it off.
To you.
To me personally.
And
right?
to me, but somebody might think it's great feng shui for them.
Somebody might think it's great feng shui, but I don't know. I mean, they might love their row house. They might find it very charming. I don't know how, I'll just say this. Everything feels compartmentalized in a row house. Everything feels segmented off. It doesn't feel like there's very much congregative, natural, organic congregative nature. So that's really interesting. I just kind of want to put a pin in that. The other component is that there's still this old concept that is sort of a throwback from, when the United States was owned by England, or has still had very, sort of British concepts about land and property, where you can actually you can own your house, but somebody else owns the land underneath you.
You have to pay ground rent to them in the state of Maryland.
Right. This is very unique to Maryland, I believe.
I don't know of other jurisdictions. There might be other jurisdictions in the country that have this type of setup, but in Maryland, this is very specific to this.
Right. So there's this combination of compartmentalized homes that don't get a lot of sunlight through them for the most part. Most of them don't, right? Only the end ones have a little bit more light coming in. Very compartmentalized, difficult to congregate with your own family, and you don't actually own it. Like, not fully. The ground underneath you is owned by somebody else.
Potentially, yes.
Right. Okay, so what's the point of me mentioning all this? Well, my sister-in-law is right now getting her doctorate for, I don't even know what they specifically call it. I've been calling it psychological architecture. She's one of like 10 people in the world that's really mastered this. And effectively what it is it's creating, or it's like drafting up architecture, buildings, homes, etc., that are specifically designed for behavior change, right? Like you create something because you're trying to encourage a specific behavior. The easiest example of this is like casinos, right? You walk into a casino and the casino is dictating your behavior as soon as you walk into it, right? It is specifically designed in a way that gets you to behave in the way that the casino owner wants you to behave.
No windows, no clocks. You can't tell what time it is. It feels like it's daytime, no matter what time of day. Loud music or loud dinging noises and music and visceral imagery and all this energy to get you to spend money there.
And carpet paths that take you to certain places where you can kind of get lost. And it's really, as soon as you walk into a casino, it's very difficult to be a free moral agent because they've designed it that way. Another example of this is like Disney World and Disneyland. All the parks are created by people who have studied psychological architecture. So there are certain things like there are no garbage cans that are how far away from each other? It's like
something like 20 feet or something
20
like
feet,
that.
Right? There's a garbage can like every 20 feet because they studied and noticed that people would not throw things away if a garbage can was more than 20 feet away from them. So they've set up garbage cans to encourage behavior modification. They want you to throw away your trash. And so they make sure that they set up the park so that you'll throw away your trash. So basically it's like an understanding of how humans navigate a space and how they're impacted by their space. So the reason why I mention all that is it just dawned on me one time when we were driving through. Is it possible that the very architecture of the buildings that the majority of people in Baltimore City live in is impacting and influencing their behavior in a way where it might feel oppressive, or it might feel compartmentalized, or they might not be getting enough vitamin D, or they might not feel like they have full ownership, right? Like, is there something about how the homes themselves are constructed? Now, there's not just row houses. There's single family residences all over too. However, most people live in a row house, right? I would argue probably, I don't know. I have no idea. I'm pulling this figure out of my ass, but like 50 to 65% of people live in row houses in the city proper.
It's certainly a large percentage of Baltimore City and other cities like Philadelphia and DC and places like that. This is a popular building technique at that time period.
And is it possible that the psychological architecture of the space is actually encouraging negative behavior? Right? Like the behavior change is actually for the negative. Now, I don't know that to be true, but the point of this podcast is to ask ourselves, what are the nodes in the system? What could be a node in the system? What are the things that could be influencing people to behave in a certain way? And if we can spend 55 minutes defining the problem, right? Like, you might hold that and look at it and break that down and go, you know what? I've done this study on the architecture and it actually has absolutely zero impact on the way that people behave. And people seem to be, happier in row houses than they are in single family residences. And there's like been huge studies done on it. Okay, cool. So that's BS. And it just came up for me, and I had a question about it. But it's being willing to go down to the foundational components of how these cities are designed, of what's going on with these cities. How long have we been experiencing these problems? How long have people been, engaged in what appears to be racial tension when it might not be racial tension at all? It might be Graves level tension. Like, how can we take an understanding of the abstraction of models and then bring them down to real life situations and see if we can't create a clear diagnostic on what's happening?
As you said that I always try to apply things to me personally. And if you're listening, you're probably intuitive, or at least you have an intuitional bent. So you like to connect patterns. And as you're asking that, I'm sitting here saying to myself, what are the things in my life? What are the nodes in the systems of my life that are not obvious, like architecture, for example, that I might not be considering in the things that are challenges for me? Because we probably all have things that we're not including in our, like, maybe you're pretty good at systems thinking, you've taken a lot of nodes in, but there are some non-obvious things that you're not seeing to say, oh, maybe I could ask the question about that thing. It seems like that's a no-brainer, but maybe I'll add that in as a node, like something like architecture, as I'm thinking about this in my life, whatever that might be. And then the other thing that comes to mind is when you were talking about the guy who was most likely a Graves 3, from the warlord phase, like literally trying to cut the fire hose to prevent the firefighters from putting out the fire in this neighborhood. And he said, well, it's not my neighborhood. I don't care. Like, we look at that and we go, oh, he just doesn't know. He doesn't know that might be the neighborhood his water's produced in, and it sends the water over to his neighborhood. And if that neighborhood burns to the ground, he's not going to have water the next day out of his sink tap. And we almost like judge him for that because maybe you're at a higher Graves level. But what are you not seeing? And what am I not seeing in our lives now? Because we are probably doing the same thing just on a bigger scale than that guy, right? We're probably looking at something in our lives and we haven't made the connection to say, oh, I see, there's a bigger thing going on here. There's a bigger picture happening here. It's not just my worldview that I can see. There's probably something I don't know that's affecting this, or that I'll be impacting, that I haven't taken into account in my personal life. And I look at somebody like that Graves 3 guy and I judge him for his lack of systems thinking, his lack of ecology thinking. He doesn't think ecologically at all. And I judge him. Well, wait a minute. What are the things in my life I'm doing in the same way, just on a bigger scale or in a different way? And how can I look at this differently and start to say, well, maybe I don't have all the answers either.
Yeah, we all think we're at the pinnacle of development.
Yeah, and I know I'm not. I know there's stuff above where I'm at right now, and there always will be. There's always room for growth.
Totally.
I'm never going to know all the answers.
Yeah, so those are great questions. And when you have maps and models, you probably, as the listener, have a map or a model that you work with that we haven't mentioned, right? I mean, we work with a ton of them, and you probably have picked up some maps and models on your own. So as you're dealing with challenges, ask yourself, we regularly ask ourselves these questions about general semantics, systems thinking, Graves level, etc. When we're dealing with a challenge, the first thing we do is like, okay, so what are we oversimplifying here, right? Like, what are we, what term are we using? Maybe what word are we using that is actually altering our thinking about this subject that is, we've oversimplified it by only having one category for this, and there's a bunch of subcategories. We just recently realized that the words and language we use about our daughter is actually probably going to damage her. Like, we have this, she's very strong-willed. She's a very aggressive kid. She's like almost 3 years old, and she's got a lot of anger in her. I'm not sure where the anger came from. Probably my side of the family. But she's got all this anger in her. And so we've been calling her Little Napoleon, right? And whatever comes along with Little Napoleon, right? Like, I think I've said in jest, like, she's not a good person. Like, she's not a good human being, right? Like, as a joke to kind of diffuse her bad behavior in public or whatever. And that's me being insecure, and that's me, like, trying to diffuse an awkward situation. And then I thought, oh my God, I'm talking about my daughter as if she's not a good human being. I actually put those words into the universe. So, like, and that's just a really great example. Not great as in good, but great as in illustrative example of how we throw words out casually into the universe, and then we go, oh my gosh, what are my instructions to the universe today? Oh, that my daughter is not a good human being.
What reality are you creating with your words?
Exactly. So like a week ago, I'm like, I have got to stop. I have got to be only using, I don't care how embarrassed I am about her, her behavior in public. I need to be using affirming language at all times. So what words am I using? How am I oversimplifying things? What are the nodes in the system that I'm not seeing? What's the Graves level that's going on with people? How are we dealing with the clashes between Graves levels? And then, of course, Myers-Briggs comes into effect. What personality types are we utilizing? What are they doing when they're defensive? The Enneagram comes into play. What strategies are we implementing in order to run away from our biggest fears? So when you have all of these models available to you, you really have an ability to create a solid diagnostic. The pundits you were talking about on air, they've got 5 minutes of discourse and 55 minutes of arguing about what they think the solution is. We really need to alter that percentage. We need to be spending most of our time in diagnostic, and then once the actual diagnosis becomes clear, once it's clear what's actually happening, and we could be wrong, but the more clarity we can get, the better. Then we move on to, prescription and actually trying to create a solution.
I think it's coming. I mean, just structurally, we would never be a terrestrial radio show having these discussions, most likely. We just don't have, it's not enough of a popular audience that would tune in. The millions of people couldn't tune in on a radio station or a television station to watch what we talk about here on this podcast. But this podcast and the technology this has brought has enabled discussions like what we're doing right now to happen. And I think technology will bring more of those formats, because a lot of that television stuff that I'm talking about, the reason why the pundits do that is the system, the structure of the television program itself lends itself to that type of discourse. That's how they sell ads. That's how they move in that world, that broadcast world. Whereas here on this podcast, we're not beholden to sponsors right now. We don't have people telling us we can't say this or that, or they're not going to sponsor our show. We can say whatever we want. We can engage in a conversation with you, the listener, and we can have a real dialogue about real issues because we're not beholden to structures that limit that.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a great point.
So I guess we can wrap up here. I know that we just opened a lot of loops, and obviously we were never intending to solve the problems of Baltimore City, protests, riots, things like that. We wanted to use it as a backdrop.
Well, and any assertion that we made, we don't believe we know. This is just us attempting to use an issue that is very much in the public eye right now.
And personal to us.
Yeah, and personal to us as a backdrop or as a platform for understanding how we can have practical application for some of these more abstract ideas that we've introduced before.
If this is new for you, one of the easiest things to start with as an actual exercise. So you're like, wow, you just talked about all these models and frameworks. I'm overwhelmed. When Antonia said if you had 60 minutes to solve a problem, you'd spend 55 minutes defining that problem. A great clarifying question for you. Anytime you're in a challenge in your life or you're working through a problem in your life, it is a very clarifying question, a very simple question. What problem am I actually trying to solve here? What problem are we trying to solve here? And I believe just that in the simple things in your life, the problems that come up for you or the challenges that come up for you, because oftentimes we're unclear about what problem. We start addressing it without really understanding what it is we're trying to solve, what we want the outcome to be. So I think that's a very clarifying question. Is like your first step into this world of, you start going down, maybe there's a problem in your business or career and you start talking to your spouse or your friend about the solutions and you stop and go, wait, what's the actual problem I'm trying to solve here? And then you get clarity around that. And then oftentimes the answer is more obvious because you have clarity around what the problem is itself.
Yeah, that's such a great clarifying question. And I think on top of that, recognizing that these are disciplines, this is not something that you just automatically like, oh, okay, well, now I'm going to think of everything in terms of systems. We actually mentioned this in the systems thinking podcast. It's a discipline. It's a way of thinking. So if you are overwhelmed with some of these models, It's understandable, and it's not something that you just immediately adopt and incorporate in your life. One of the reasons why we really wanted to do this podcast is because we understand that some of these models can be a little esoteric, a little out of reach, and it's hard to understand how it's a way of thinking. It's hard to even begin the discipline because it's difficult to know how it could be applied. So this was intentionally, this was intended to be an application podcast, how to take some of these more abstract principles and show an example of how the discipline can look when you start, seeing application through it.
Absolutely. What do you think? We invite you to come on to personalityhacker.com under this podcast. So you can also find us. The community of Personality Hacker is growing leaps and bounds over at facebook.com/personalityhacker or over at twitter.com/personalityhack. Those are two great community platforms to engage with us in the social media realm. And obviously, personalityhacker.com is our main website where you can take the personality test, find out what your personality is, and some of the best ways to grow, starting from the framework of who am I as a person in this life showing up.
Yeah, and you can also rate us on iTunes. Go to iTunes and let us know how you feel, and leave a review if you'd like. The reviews are also lovely, so please feel free to both rate and review us on iTunes.
Thank you for being a part of this podcast this week. We really appreciate you tuning in. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
We can't wait to talk to you on the next episode.